Hey everyone. Welcome to tonight's dive into one of those hidden corners of history that rarely makes it onto the big screens or school textbooks, but once you hear it, you can't unhear it. Forget the battles and generals for a second. Tonight, we're exploring something more personal, more primal, survival through what they ate. But this isn't your average tale of rations and canned goods. This is the bizarre, gritty, sometimes downright disturbing story of battlefield food during one of the most overlooked conflicts of the 20th century, the Forgotten Front Wars. Wherever you're tuning in from, drop your city and country in the comments. And hey, tell me what snack or drink you've got with you. You're going to want something to chew on, because after this, you'll never look at your lunch the same way again. Dim those lights, maybe turn up the fan for that atmospheric hum. And let's unravel a side of history your history teacher definitely skipped. When you picture soldiers in wartime, maybe you think of the trenches, the artillery blasts, the gray skies stained with smoke. But behind every uniform, every medal, every scar, there's a stomach trying to stay full. And believe me, how they managed that on the Forgotten Front was a story in itself. Let's rewind to the year 1913. This wasn't a world at peace. Sure, the newspapers tried to pretend everything was under control, but border tensions, secret treaties, and whispers of rebellion echoed across continents. And in the shadow of these political chess games, smaller nations, colonies, and outposts became tangled in their own local conflicts. Battles that history tends to shove into the footnotes. But for the soldiers fighting there, these wars were anything but small. And here's the thing no one ever talks about. How do you fuel thousands of troops in climates that make logistics a nightmare? We're talking jungles thick enough to swallow supply caravans whole, deserts so dry even the shadows felt parched, mountain passes that laughed in the face of modern transport. In those conditions, standard military rations? They didn't just arrive late, they often didn't arrive at all. Which meant one thing: soldiers had to get creative. Take the troops stationed along the eastern archipelago, a cluster of islands locked in bitter conflict that the major powers barely acknowledged. They were sent in with crates of dried provisions, salted fish, compressed rice cakes, bricks of cured tofu harder than optimism after 3 weeks in the field. It all sounded manageable, on paper. But nobody mentioned the relentless humidity that turned dried rice into a fuzzy science experiment within days, or the swarms of insects that made guarding your meal harder than guarding your post. So soldiers adapted. They foraged in dense forests where roots, fruits, and, when luck allowed, wild game became the real menu. But let's not romanticize it. This wasn't a paradise buffet. Soldiers boiled roots that tasted like old shoes, roasted bugs because they had more protein than the official rations, and drank rainwater filtered through leaves, hoping the jungle's more deadly inhabitants stayed out of their stomachs. And those compressed tofu blocks? They weren't just food. Once they turned rock solid, soldiers used them to patch holes in tents, anchor makeshift shelters, or, according to one soldier's letter, as emergency weapons, provided you had the wrist strength to hurl them. Across the dry plains of the southern front, soldiers faced the opposite problem. Too much dust, not enough water, and food that arrived sun-baked and crawling with opportunistic insects. The rations? Strips of dried lamb jerky, hard flatbread discs, preserved fruits so sugared they crystallized into teeth-shattering shards. And yet, the human body's stubborn need for calories didn't care about sandstorms or ambushes. Soldiers ground flatbread into powder, mixing it with river water when they found it, creating a gritty, semi-edible paste affectionately nicknamed desert porridge. Jerky was soaked in sweat-dampened cloths to soften it enough to chew, and preserved fruits were boiled into syrup when possible, doubling as an energy boost and impromptu wound dressing. But where these soldiers truly showcased their battlefield culinary genius? The makeshift brews. Every army seems to have one, a concoction designed less for nutrition and more for the illusion of comfort. In the southern front, they brewed Sunfire tea, a mixture of dried herbs, boiled cactus sap, and whatever caffeine source could be scavenged. It didn't taste good, it didn't look good. But when you've been awake for 36 hours dodging sniper fire, taste isn't the priority. Meanwhile, in the frost-bound highlands, where temperatures dipped low enough to freeze rifle oil, soldiers fought hunger on an entirely different battlefield. Official rations, salted fish, root vegetables, dense bread loaves, froze solid within hours of distribution. Trying to eat was like gnawing on bricks. Survival meant improvisation. Snow was melted in helmet tops mixed with foraged berries or edible moss. Soldiers created stone soups, boiling rocks to heat water, then adding ration crumbs, herbs, or tiny portions of dried meat. The stones stayed. The hunger mostly stayed too. There's one documented account of a Highland soldier who, tired of chewing on ice blocks disguised as bread, devised a new method, slicing bread into thin strips, tucking them inside his uniform, and letting body heat thaw them over hours. Not the most hygienic tactic, but hunger rarely respects hygiene. On the coastal watchposts, stationed along treacherous cliffs and rocky shores, soldiers were promised fresh seafood as part of the recruitment incentive. Reality? When the tides cooperated, they harvested shellfish, seaweed, and the occasional unlucky fish caught in tide pools. But when storms battered the coast for days, the sea offered nothing but salt spray and seagull droppings. Here, hunger birthed the infamous Clamstone stew, a broth of boiled seawater, limp seaweed, and empty clam shells, included for the illusion of protein. Morale wasn't high, but the jokes were relentless. Soldiers dubbed it Admiral's Delight, a sarcastic nod to the absent naval support. We can't ignore the psychological toll. Eating isn't just fueling the body, it's ritual, it's connection to home. It's a reminder that beyond the mud and bullets, civilization still exists somewhere. And when meals devolve into scavenged roots or boiled moss, that fragile connection frays fast. Letters from soldiers across these forgotten fronts speak volumes. One reads, "We eat because we must, not because we should." The bread fights back. The stew defies reason, yet hunger insists, so we endure. And endure they did, across jungles, deserts, mountains, and coasts, crafting meals from desperation, necessity, and scraps of hope. And we've only scratched the surface of the Forgotten Front's culinary chaos. Next, we dive into the bizarre, often tragic evolution of battlefield drinks, from jungle brews to snowmelt coffee, and everything in between. Across every battlefield of history, there exists one universal truth. No matter the uniform, language, or allegiance, every soldier craves the same thing beyond survival. A taste of something familiar, something warm, something that reminds them they are still human beneath the grime, the exhaustion, and the echo of gunfire. And nowhere was this craving more desperate than among the scattered regiments of the Jungle Division, buried deep within the rain-soaked interiors of the equatorial belt during the lesser-known colonial resource wars of the early 1900s. Imagine trudging through waist-high mud, your boots rotting with each step, your uniform permanently damp, your body riddled with insect bites, and in that misery, your only comfort? A dented ration tin filled with gelatinous preserved fruit or sun-baked protein bars as dense as concrete. The soldiers deployed here quickly learned the hard way that official rations, while meticulously catalogued by distant quartermasters, rarely survived the journey intact. Cans rusted beyond recognition, packaging split open, and the tropics consumed everything with relentless efficiency. As a result, meals became acts of improvisation as much as sustenance. In the muddy outposts along the riverbanks, soldiers adapted, fishing for river eels and foraging wild tubers that, when boiled long enough, softened into a bland, starchy mush, the texture of overcooked wallpaper paste but packed with just enough energy to stagger through another patrol. The infamous eel broth was both feared and revered. A concoction of river water, scraps of preserved meat when available, and slices of eel or amphibian flesh simmered over fires, fueled by damp wood and desperation. It didn't win culinary awards, but it filled stomachs and silenced growling guts beneath the constant buzz of mosquitoes. But it wasn't just about food. Drinks, or rather the illusion of them, played a psychological role that cannot be overstated. Soldiers along the jungle front brewed what they jokingly called swamp tea, a steaming mixture of boiled river water, crushed medicinal leaves, and occasionally a splash of fermented fruit juice, if some had survived the journey. It tasted earthy, bitter, and vaguely toxic, but the heat alone provided a flicker of comfort. a reminder of home kitchens and quiet evenings, now so far removed from the mildew-drenched trenches. In the neighboring savanna conflict zones, where arid winds swept across dusty plains and shade was rarer than ammunition, dehydration was the real enemy. Official water supplies, shipped in bulky metal containers, often arrived tainted, riddled with rust flakes or already evaporated under the relentless sun. Soldiers resorted to digging shallow wells or collecting morning dew with cloth scraps wrung into canteens. More resourceful units concocted desert tonic, a grim cocktail of cactus pulp, scavenged berries and brackish water strained through fabric filters. It wasn't clean by medical standards, but when thirst clawed at your throat and your vision blurred beneath the merciless sun, clarity and sanitation became luxuries few could afford. Letters home revealed the bleak humor soldiers maintained in the face of such meager rations. One corporal stationed along the windward ridge scribbled, "Our tea tastes like history, old, bitter, and full of sediment, but it's hot, so we pretend it's a luxury cafe, and for 5 minutes, we remember civilization." Further east, nestled within the icy cliffs of the northern plateaus, troops faced a different culinary battlefield altogether. Here, firewood was scarce, temperatures plummeted below freezing, and official supplies often froze solid before reaching the front lines. Soldiers relied on snowmelt soups, bowls of warm water, thickened with ration crumbs or foraged roots, flavored with a handful of herbs when available, and consumed in near silence beneath frostbitten stars. Even more notorious was the winter brew, a searing hot mixture of melted snow, roasted grain husks, and the faintest hint of alcohol, often fermented in secret beneath supply tents. It was a morale booster, an illegal indulgence, and a reminder that even in the coldest corners of the world, rebellion simmered beneath the surface. Across these varied fronts, one theme echoed louder than any artillery blast: necessity bred ingenuity. Every regiment, regardless of their flag, crafted makeshift meals from whatever the unforgiving environment allowed. Jungle roots, desert berries, mountain herbs, coastal fish, all became parts of an improvised, often tragic culinary tradition written in hunger and survival. And yet, amidst the moldy bread, bitter brews, and foraged fungi, soldiers clung to these rituals. Food, no matter how unrecognizable, grounded them, tethered them to some fading memory of normalcy, reminding them they were not just expendable bodies in a distant war, but human beings with taste buds, cravings, and a stubborn will to endure. But this is just the beginning. Ahead, we'll explore the ingenious, sometimes shocking lengths soldiers went to preserve food in these impossible conditions. From trench ovens carved into rock walls, to clandestine fermentation projects that defied military regulation and fueled both rebellion and resilience in equal measure. As the conflicts dragged on, what began as improvised survival tactics evolved into something far more organized, yet equally bizarre: the birth of the battlefield kitchen revolution. Soldiers, driven by necessity and the unrelenting pangs of hunger, turned their trenches, outposts, and even abandoned vehicles into makeshift culinary zones that blurred the lines between desperation and creativity. One of the most infamous examples came from the Highland Regiment stationed along the icy cliffs of the northern plateaus. Supplies there arrived frozen solid, canned meat transforming into steel-hard blocks, bread loaves becoming inedible bricks, and water freezing mid-pour. But where others saw logistical failure, the soldiers saw opportunity. Using salvaged artillery casings, discarded metal scraps, and even shattered helmets, they constructed trench forges, rudimentary stoves capable of burning whatever flammable material could be scavenged from the barren landscape. Twigs, bits of uniforms, broken rifle stocks, nothing was off limits if it fueled the fire. Over these flickering flames they boiled water for tea, thawed bread and simmered soups thick with ration crumbs and foraged moss. Soldiers became culinary engineers, crafting recipes that straddled the line between nutrition and grim determination. In their letters, they wrote of stone broth, boiling river pebbles alongside ration crumbs and herbs to absorb heat and stretch meager portions. Others spoke of frost cakes, pancakes fashioned from thawed bread mash, seared on the backs of metal plates heated over open flames. These meals weren't merely about sustenance. They became rituals of rebellion against the dehumanizing grind of endless warfare. Along the parched dunes of the southern conflict zones, where dehydration threatened more lives than bullets, soldiers devised entirely new methods of food preservation. Traditional rations spoiled within hours beneath the brutal sun, bread crumbled into dust, and dried meats became brittle as glass. In response, troops experimented with sun-drying fruits scavenged from local oases, fermenting cactus pulp into syrupy energy boosts, and preserving fish in layers of salt and sand, transforming them into protein-rich, albeit sand-coated, emergency snacks. It was within these desert ranks that the infamous mirror bread emerged. Thin, reflective wafers of hardened dough, sun-baked on polished metal surfaces until they gleamed like signal mirrors. Soldiers claimed you could see your own face before breaking the wafer, a grim reflection of the exhaustion etched into every sunburnt cheek. Coastal regiments stationed along the rocky fjords of the northern outposts faced equally brutal challenges. Here, the sea provided, but not always kindly. Fish were abundant, but preservation proved near impossible under constant salt spray and freezing winds. Soldiers turned to pickling, crafting brine solutions from seawater, vinegar, and scavenged herbs, submerging fish, seaweed, even mollusks, in makeshift barrels buried beneath the frost. The result? Tangy, salty meals that staved off scurvy and injected fleeting bursts of flavor into otherwise bland, repetitive diets. But the battlefield culinary arms race didn't stop at mere preservation. Fermentation. Once the domain of trained brewers and distant supply depots, became a frontline tradition. In the humid interiors of the equatorial jungles, regiments constructed ferment pits, concealed beneath camouflage nets and palm fronds. Into these pits went fruit scraps, foraged roots, and leftover rations, allowed to ferment under controlled conditions. The outcome? Potent, fizzy brews capable of lifting spirits and, on occasion, fogging judgment just enough to forget the omnipresent drone of jungle warfare. High Command disapproved, of course. Regulations forbade unauthorized alcohol production, citing discipline, efficiency, and the ever-present threat of contaminated supplies. But soldiers, ever resourceful, continued their fermentation projects under cover of darkness, sharing contraband brews in quiet celebration of defiance and fragile camaraderie. Letters smuggled home carried tales of jungle firewater, desert whiskey, and coastal brine ale, each a testament to the unbreakable human urge to cling to fragments of normalcy, even amidst chaos. Across the snow-draped fortresses of the boreal highlands, where temperatures plummeted and supplies froze solid, soldiers experimented with ice cellars, hollowed-out snowbanks and frost caves, insulated with animal hides and spare uniforms, used to store thawed rations and ferment grain-based stews. There, Glacier Gruel became both sustenance and legend, a porridge of boiled grains, melted snow, and fermented berries, thick enough to stand a bayonet upright, and potent enough to numb both hunger and hypothermia in equal measure. These culinary creations, born from starvation and stubborn resilience, transformed survival into ritual, turning bleak, frozen trenches, parched desert encampments, and rain-soaked jungle outposts into unlikely sanctuaries of human defiance. And yet, for all the ingenuity displayed, the battles for food weren't limited to soldiers alone. Civilians, caught in the crossfire of forgotten wars, engaged in their own kitchen revolutions, forging meals from scarcity and resistance. But that, my friends, is a story for the next chapter. Beyond the trenches, the bunkers, and the outposts where soldiers braved the unforgiving fronts, another battle raged in silence. The kitchens and hearths of civilian homes caught in the path of war. For those left behind, feeding their families was as harrowing as facing the rifles and just as dangerous. With farmlands trampled beneath marching boots, markets empty of essentials, and ration cards replacing currency, survival turned every home into a battlefield of scarcity. In the once bustling port cities now shadowed by military blockades, markets that had overflowed with spices, produce, and ocean harvests became desolate stretches of boarded-up stalls and shattered glass. Families scoured alleyways for scraps, peeling bark from trees to create broth, grinding seeds and husks into coarse flour, or fermenting vegetable peels into thin, sour soups, known locally as widow's brew. Across the frostbitten mountain villages, where winter came early and supplies never arrived on time, households relied on the bitter generosity of the land itself. Dandelion roots, pine needles, and foraged mushrooms, once overlooked as weeds or vermin fodder, transformed into the building blocks of survival cuisine. Bitter stews simmered for hours over flickering hearths, thickened with bark flour or mashed tubers scraped from frozen soil. These meals lacked flavor, lacked pride, but they filled the belly, however briefly, and in times of war, that was enough. In coastal hamlets battered by artillery and salt winds, fish once abundant in the shallows now swam beyond reach, driven away by naval warfare. Desperate families turned to seaweed, kelp, and barnacles, boiling them into gelatinous broths that clung to the ribs more by texture than taste. And when famine tightened its grip, meals became symbolic more than substantial. A single boiled potato shared among three, its watery broth diluted again and again to stretch the illusion of abundance. Within the smoldering ruins of urban centers, resourcefulness turned desperation into innovation. Brick ovens, once used to bake crusty loaves of bread, were dismantled and rebuilt in basements, fueled by broken furniture and splintered beams. Flourless bread substitutes emerged, mixtures of ground roots, sawdust, and what little grain could be bartered on the black market, pressed into dense gray loaves that tasted of regret and splinters, but quelled hunger for a time. In underground cellars, hidden away from occupying patrols, civilians concocted clandestine preserves, pickling wild onions, fermenting foraged berries, and crafting thin, acidic wines from fruit skins salvaged from markets long since abandoned. Every bottle, every jar represented rebellion, resilience, and the refusal to surrender dignity entirely. Children, too young to understand the complexities of war, scavenged alongside parents, collecting snails from garden walls, plucking nettles for soup, or digging through abandoned fields for forgotten tubers. In whispered stories passed down in hidden kitchens, elders spoke of ghost feasts, memories of tables heavy with food, of laughter, of warmth, a fading history that younger generations clung to as they gnawed on roots and ration scraps beneath the hum of distant artillery. But perhaps the most haunting testament to human endurance came from the border villages caught between advancing armies, where survival demanded choices that blurred morality. Livestock dwindled, crops withered, and neighbors vanished into the fog of conflict. In these fractured communities, rumors whispered of meals crafted from the unimaginable, household pets, scavenged carrion, even abandoned enemy provisions rebranded as victory spoils. One chilling account spoke of a widow, left alone in a bombed-out farmhouse, who transformed stale flour, shredded curtains, and melted candle wax into war pastries. Brittle, tasteless, yet calorie-laden creations that staved off starvation for weeks. Her ingenuity became legend. Her pastries passed around as both nourishment and quiet rebellion against the decay of civilization. Across continents, despite cultural divides, one truth united these forgotten kitchens. Hunger, in its cruel equality, demanded creativity, and no corner of the world, no matter how isolated, escaped its grip. Yet even amidst this grim portrait of deprivation, stories of defiance flickered like candlelight in the darkness. Families, huddled together in basements, shared diluted stews with strangers, bartered preserves for firewood, or traded recipes for meals forged from nothing but desperation and stubborn hope. These were not just recipes. They were blueprints for survival, legacies of human resilience written in soot-stained cookbooks and scribbled notes passed between trembling hands. And so, as soldiers fought on distant fronts, as empires clashed and history etched its tragedies into stone, the humble kitchens of civilians waged their own quiet, relentless war, one meal at a time, one act of defiance at a time. But our story is far from over. Ahead, we peel back the next layer of this hidden history: the battlefield marketplaces, the underground food smuggling rings, the black markets that thrived in the shadows of collapsed supply chains. While soldiers rationed, civilians scavenged, and kitchens simmered with fragments of forgotten meals, An entirely different theater of survival thrived in the shadows. The clandestine markets, smugglers' alleys, and makeshift trading hubs where food became the most dangerous and valuable currency of all. Across war-ravaged cities and decimated rural roads, supply lines cracked under the weight of demand, official distributions faltered, and rations evaporated before reaching the desperate. Into that void stepped an underground network of traders, bartering not in gold or coin but in bread, preserved meats, spices, and whatever sustenance could be smuggled past checkpoints and patrols. These black markets, hidden beneath shattered rooftops or tucked into forgotten alleyways, pulsed with quiet rebellion. Here, amidst whispers and wary glances, loaves of dense, rationed bread traded hands like contraband, jars of pickled roots exchanged for bullets, and bundles of herbs fetched prices higher than precious metals. Every transaction carried risk. Soldiers patrolled these hidden corners, suspicious of any gathering that hinted at defiance or resource hoarding. Yet hunger outweighed fear, and so the markets thrived, their stalls laden with jars of foraged berries, illicit bottles of thin, fermented wines, and baskets of eggs so rare they drew crowds like whispered legends. Along the shattered railways that once connected thriving towns, rogue trains transported more than ammunition and soldiers. Smugglers disguised as railway workers ferried sacks of grain, crates of dried fish, and bundles of firewood beneath tarps and false floors, bribing officials with scarce luxuries, soap, matches, or the occasional bottle of contraband liquor. Their routes snaked through abandoned villages, over mountain passes, and along forgotten coastal inlets where military patrols rarely lingered. But with every successful run came tales of those caught, stripped of their goods, imprisoned, or worse, left as a grim warning along the roadside. Yet the trade persisted. In border towns fractured by shifting front lines, entire economies rose from these underworld exchanges. Former merchants, displaced farmers, even children transformed into brokers of necessity, navigating the tangled web of food scarcity with unsettling ease. One famed smuggler, known only as the Lantern, orchestrated nighttime convoys through frostbitten forests, delivering sacks of grain, preserved meats, and smoked cheeses to villages cut off by siege. Locals whispered that his lantern's faint glow signaled salvation in the darkness, though none dared linger long after the exchange, fearing discovery by watchful soldiers or desperate neighbors. In the humid coastal enclaves where naval blockades strangled ports, families turned fishing boats into floating markets, exchanging salted fish and sun-dried seaweed beneath moonlight. The waves masked their movements, and the rhythmic creaking of boats became the soundtrack of silent rebellion against enforced hunger. Even within occupied cities, hidden cellars and shadowed basements transformed into trading hubs where foreign spices fetched outrageous sums, smuggled chocolate bars became symbols of hope, and forbidden fruits, literally and metaphorically, circulated beneath the radar of military control. But not all who walked these markets did so out of pure survival. Some hoarded, profiting from scarcity, turning the misery of many into wealth for the few. Black market kings emerged, enigmatic figures who controlled the flow of food with ruthless precision, deciding which communities received sustenance and which were left to starve. Their power rivaled that of military officials, and their names carried both reverence and resentment in whispered conversations. Yet for every profiteer exploiting scarcity, there were countless others risking everything to nourish families, share warmth, and preserve dignity. In a world fractured by conflict, these hidden markets became lifelines, a chaotic, dangerous, yet utterly essential reminder that even in the darkest times, humanity finds a way to barter, share, and survive. But the story doesn't end there. Beyond smuggled bread and secret markets lies an even stranger chapter: the battlefield feasts, the moments of absurd celebration where enemies paused, meals were shared, and the fragile thread of shared humanity flickered to life, if only for a heartbeat. War, in its cold calculation, is built on lines drawn in dirt, in flags raised over rubble, in uniforms stitched with the symbols of opposing causes. But occasionally, in moments so fragile they feel like hallucinations, those lines dissolve, and food of all things becomes the quiet rebellion that reminds every soldier, every civilian, of the humanity buried beneath the armor and the blood. Throughout the forgotten fronts, scattered accounts whispered of these impossible moments. Battlefield feasts, strange truces where hunger, not politics, dictated the rules. In the jagged highlands where mountain troops clung to frozen cliffs, a notorious winter standstill stretched for weeks. Supplies froze before reaching the trenches, patrols risked frostbite with every step, and both sides, exhausted by cold and hunger, found themselves locked in a battle against the elements rather than each other. It was here, amidst snowdrifts taller than men, that the first unlikely feast unfolded. On one side of the ravine, soldiers roasted whatever rations remained. Brittle bread, thawed roots, even strips of uniform fabric soaked in broth to stretch the illusion of food. On the other, their enemies did the same, separated by mere meters of ice and decades of resentment. But hunger, like winter, is indiscriminate. As smoke drifted across the frozen divide, gestures replaced bullets. Soldiers exchanged nods, then shouts, then cautiously parcels of bread, preserved meat, and fermented berries tossed across the snow under cover of twilight. For one surreal night, enemies became strangers sharing scraps, their laughter muffled beneath scarves, their boots crunching the same ice. There were no toasts, no peace declarations, only the quiet crackle of makeshift fires and the brief illusion of normalcy amidst the madness. In the coastal trenches battered by ceaseless storms, a different truce simmered to life beneath the rumble of distant artillery. Both sides, marooned by weather and forgotten by supply ships, faced the same cruel shortage of food. Days turned to weeks. Rations dwindled to crumbs, and scavenging the rocky tide pools became the sole means of survival. One fog-choked morning, as soldiers picked through seaweed and barnacle-encrusted rocks, they discovered an unexpected bounty, a school of stranded fish, tossed ashore by a violent storm. It was a gift neither side could afford to squander, and so, with wary glances and rifles slung low, soldiers from opposing camps met at the jagged shoreline, hauling nets, sharing salted water, and roasting fish over driftwood fires fueled by shattered crates and forgotten oaths. They spoke different languages, bore different flags, yet for hours, those divisions drowned beneath the scent of sizzling flesh and salt air. In battered towns reduced to rubble, where civilians survived in skeletal buildings with nothing but ration dust and defiance, hidden kitchens ignited their own moments of rebellion. During rare ceasefires, families emerged from cellars to share foraged meals, bitter root stews, pine needle tea, or bread stretched with sawdust, their whispered conversations carrying across rubble-strewn streets as quiet resistance against the decay surrounding them. Even in jungles choked by humidity and conflict, where every leaf concealed danger, soldiers carved out improbable sanctuaries. Around flickering campfires shielded beneath towering ferns, troops from rival factions sometimes found themselves drawn together by necessity. Shared meals of roasted fruit, boiled tubers, and the faint sting of fermented sap replaced combat. For a night, for an hour, long enough to remember that hunger levels every uniform. These battlefield feasts, brief as they were, never altered the course of war. When dawn broke, rifles were shouldered, orders barked, and the machinery of conflict ground forward once more. But those moments left marks deeper than scars, reminders that beneath propaganda, beneath orders, every soldier dreams of warmth, of food, of fleeting connection. As stories of these forbidden gatherings filtered back to command posts, reactions varied. Some officers turned a blind eye, others issued harsh reprimands, but none could erase the truth that simmered beneath the surface. Even in war, food refuses to respect borders. But the strangest chapters are still ahead. Next, we peel back the myths surrounding the most legendary meals of wartime, from stews boiled in helmet tops to the mysterious recipes said to bring good luck or stave off death itself. As the wars dragged on and soldiers became unwilling connoisseurs of scarcity, the front lines simmered with strange tales, whispered stories of meals that carried more than calories. In the mud-soaked trenches beneath frost-bitten mountains and deep within dense jungles, food wasn't just survival. It was folklore, superstition, and sometimes, the final desperate grip on fate itself. Across fractured units stationed in the swampy lowlands of the southern front, One legend endured with stubborn persistence: the belief that boiling a stew in a soldier's helmet, provided it was taken from the battlefield, and only after the soldier had left his mark in combat, brought good fortune. Of course, helmets weren't designed as cookware, yet desperation defied design. Soldiers filled dented helmets with river water, scraps of ration meat, wild herbs, and foraged roots, simmering concoctions over open flames. The resulting stews were as unpredictable as the war itself, sometimes hearty, other times a thin, smoky broth, laced with traces of metal. But believers swore that these meals, forged in stolen moments of warmth, turned the tide of patrols, softened the sting of hunger, and on rare occasions, shielded them from bullets. Skeptics called it madness, but when rations dwindled and hope eroded, even the most hardened veterans found comfort stirring helmet-brewed soups beneath the stars. In the fractured highlands, where snow suffocated sound and wind carved the earth into jagged shards, another culinary ritual thrived: the crafting of death bread. Dense, bitter loaves pressed from barley, wild grains, and, when desperation peaked, ground bark. These loaves were intentionally hard, designed to last through weeks of frost and scarcity. Soldiers carried them wrapped in oilcloth, gnawed off chunks during marches, and buried remnants beneath fallen comrades as both nourishment and tribute. Some whispered that consuming a piece of death bread before battle shielded you from the worst fates, binding you to the fallen, forging an unbreakable thread of endurance. In coastal camps battered by relentless storms, troops harvested driftwood, tangled seaweed, and the occasional edible mollusk, weaving meals from ocean scraps. Yet even here, superstitions simmered. Soldiers traded tokens, shells with natural holes, knots of braided seaweed, before sharing fish stews boiled in makeshift pots, believing these talismans anchored their souls against the crushing tides of war. The jungles birthed their own culinary myths, tangled as the vines that choked the trenches. Troops whispered of the ghost fruit, a rare, pale berry hidden deep within the rainforest, said to grant visions or protect against ambushes. Whether real or born from fevered imaginations, soldiers scoured the undergrowth. Pockets heavy with leaves, herbs, and seeds claimed to sharpen senses or mend battle wounds when steeped in boiling water. One infamous regiment swore by their nightly brew, a concoction of moss, root bark, and a splash of fermented sap, believed to bring prophetic dreams. Medical officers dismissed it as jungle folklore. Yet when missions succeeded, ambushes avoided, and patrols returned intact, even skeptics sipped the bitter brew, chasing superstition alongside fleeting warmth. Across all fronts, culinary superstitions fermented alongside hunger. Meals stretched beyond nutrition. They became rituals, prayers, offerings to whatever fragile gods watched over battlefields. Recipes scribbled on ration wrappers, ingredients traded like currency, hidden pockets of hope simmered beneath every makeshift fire. But hunger has no patience for myth alone. Ahead, we'll explore the unspoken consequences, the darkest extremes soldiers and civilians alike embraced when all other food vanished, when survival demanded impossible choices, and when the line between sustenance and sacrifice blurred beyond recognition. For all the whispered legends, battlefield rituals, and fleeting moments of culinary defiance, the brutal reality remained unchanged. When the rations ran dry, when supply lines crumbled under siege, survival teetered on the razor's edge of desperation. In these moments, the human instinct to eat, to cling to life, collided with choices so grim, they still echo in forgotten letters and hidden testimonies long after the gunfire ceased. On the scorched plateaus where the Highland regiments were marooned by ice storms and collapsed passes, entire units vanished beneath the snowdrifts, their supplies buried with them. Weeks passed, rescue impossible, and hunger hollowed every face. When foraged roots, melted snow, and shredded uniforms boiled into tasteless stews were gone, the rumors began. Soldiers slicing bark from pine trees, grinding bones into thin broth, and eventually turning to the fallen. It wasn't spoken openly, but the signs lingered. Chewed remnants, buried evidence, averted eyes. War strips many things: dignity, clarity, and in its darkest corners, the luxury of choice. Along the fragmented coastal towns, where naval blockades strangled ports and markets dissolved into black market whispers. Famine consumed entire districts. Families ground sawdust into bread, boiled leather for hours to soften it into meager sustenance, and drank rainwater flavored with rust and mildew. But when even these desperate measures collapsed, starvation twisted communities into predators of necessity. Abandoned pets vanished, livestock devoured in full, followed by unspeakable acts born not of cruelty, but the human body's ruthless demand for fuel. Soldiers posted in these famine zones documented the aftermath in terse, fragmented letters home. Glimpses of skeletal figures wandering streets, scavenging ash piles for scraps, their faces vacant, their humanity eroding with every uneaten day. In the dense jungles where disease and starvation coiled together like vines, entire camps disintegrated when supply drops failed to breach the canopy. Here, the line between predator and prey blurred grotesquely. Soldiers hunted not only game but each other's provisions, sabotage over stolen rations turning comrades into enemies overnight. More than one unit's downfall began with the theft of a hidden food cache, unraveling discipline, trust, and survival itself. Even in cities where rationing systems remained intact, scarcity hollowed traditions. Weddings celebrated with water-thinned soups, funerals marked by a single slice of bread shared among mourners, holidays reduced to whispered stories of meals that once were. Parents lied to children, filling bowls with broth flavored by memory rather than substance, while black market profiteers grew fat on scarcity, peddling crumbs at the cost of dignity. But through every act of deprivation, defiance simmered quietly. In hidden gardens carved into rubble, civilians coaxed herbs, roots, and bitter greens from contaminated soil. In cellars and trenches, recipes scrawled on tattered fabric preserved not just meals, but identity. Culinary blueprints passed down beneath the shadow of starvation. Food, no matter how meager, became an act of rebellion, proof that even stripped of abundance, humanity refused to vanish entirely. Yet hunger's shadow remains relentless, and as the war lines shifted, as soldiers and civilians alike clawed through the wreckage of forgotten fronts, the next challenge emerged: rebuilding kitchens, markets, and homes from the ashes of conflict. But that story of resilience stitched from hunger's ruins is one final chapter away. When the last shots faded and the banners of war sank beneath rubble and smoke, the true struggle began. Not in trenches or bunkers, but around empty tables and broken hearths, where survivors stared at barren cupboards and wondered how to summon life from the bones of destruction. Across the fractured cities where buildings leaned like weary soldiers and streets cracked beneath ash, kitchens were the first sanctuaries to rise from the debris. Not grand halls or parades, but battered pots set upon makeshift stoves, the faint aroma of boiling water signaling hope flickering beneath the rubble. In the mountain villages, where snow still blanketed forgotten battlefields, families chipped ice from frozen wells, coaxing stubborn herbs from the frost-bitten soil. The first harvests were thin: wild onions, bitter roots, tough greens fighting for space in contaminated earth. Yet they simmered into stews that filled homes with the sound of spoons scraping against bowls and voices cracking with tentative laughter. In port towns where sunken ships rusted like skeletal leviathans beneath the waves, fishermen patched nets with frayed rope, casting lines into uncertain tides. The ocean, bruised but undefeated, returned its gifts slowly: fish small and wary, seaweed tangled with wreckage, but enough to flavor pots, to bind communities fractured by blockade and hunger. Markets, once blackened by scarcity, blinked back to life in alleyways and courtyards. Stalls emerged from shattered stone, tables covered in bruised fruit, dried herbs, and thin loaves pressed from salvaged grain. Money held little weight. Bartering returned, potatoes traded for salt, firewood for eggs, shared smiles for bruised apples, bruised but precious. Soldiers, discharged yet still stitched with the scars of forgotten fronts, carried home more than medals or stories. They brought recipes inked on ration wrappers, survival stews learned from desperation, bread pressed from bark and roots that no longer tasted of shame but of endurance. These were not gourmet meals. They were culinary salvage, fragments of war's bitter lessons repurposed into the foundation of rebuilding. In battered cities, communal kitchens simmered with resilience. Strangers shared pots, traded stories, and taught one another how to stretch thin ingredients into feasts of defiance. Watered-down soups thickened with unity, bread lines softened by jokes, and every flickering stove a reminder that even the hungriest winters end. Yet not all wounds healed easily. Ghosts lingered, in empty chairs, in ration cards folded into memorials, in recipes recited with trembling hands for those never returning. But with every bite of bitter greens, every sip of root broth, communities stitched themselves back together, mouthful by mouthful, memory by memory. Across continents, from frozen ridges to sun-scorched deserts, the aftermath of war wasn't written in treaties alone, but in the quiet rituals of kitchens restored, in gardens sprouting from trenches, in markets bustling with cautious optimism. The lessons etched in hunger refused to vanish. They simmered in every meal. The knowledge that food, stripped of abundance, remains the final rebellion against despair, the fragile thread weaving civilization back from ruin. But one question lingers. How did these fractured communities turn those meals, those kitchens, those hard-earned recipes, into the culinary traditions we know today? That, my friends, is the final piece of this untold story. The scars of forgotten wars fade from battlefields faster than from memory. And though the soldiers, the trenches, and the ruins often dissolve into dusty archives, one legacy refuses to vanish: the meals, rituals, and recipes born from hunger and defiance. Across the reclaimed farmlands where crops once withered beneath the weight of boots and gunfire, new traditions sprouted alongside the first green shoots. Families, weathered by famine, wove wartime recipes into their cultural identity, no longer as desperate measures but as quiet homages to survival. The bread pressed from wild grains and bark evolved into dense, dark loaves still sold in village markets, rebranded as heritage cuisine, each slice carrying whispered reminders of resilience. Stews once boiled from ration scraps and foraged roots simmer now in polished kitchens, passed down as ancestors' broth, a bitter, earthy meal transformed by generations into something more nourishing than mere sustenance. Even the strange battlefield brews, crafted from moss, herbs, and jungle sap, now echo in regional drinks poured at celebrations, their once desperate origins reimagined as folklore, their bitter sting softened by time, yet their symbolism intact. In port cities rebuilt from salt-crusted ruins, markets overflow once more. Yet tucked among the fresh fish and vibrant fruit sit preserves in jars, pickled roots, and seaweed wraps that trace their lineage to blockades and black markets. Coastal recipes taught in bustling kitchens whisper of lean years when families bartered with salt and scavenged tide pools, and every meal carried the weight of defiance. Soldiers returned not just with scars, but with culinary knowledge forged in hunger. Campsite stews, ration bread tricks, improvised fermentation, all became part of local cuisine, taught to children beside stories of war not as grim warnings, but as reminders that food has always been more than sustenance. It's history on a plate. In mountain villages where snow still clings stubbornly to peaks, families bake survivor bread, dense and bitter, yet shared with reverence at winter gatherings. They sip broths boiled from herbs once plucked in secret from frozen ground, each spoonful a quiet celebration of endurance, each meal a shield against forgetting. Even in jungles where the vines once tangled with warfare, families teach recipes born in trenches and hidden camps, roasted fruits, foraged stews, the ghost fruit legend evolving into playful folklore for children, the real hunger buried beneath laughter and ritual. And as decades stretch between those hungry years and now, one truth remains: food is never just food. It carries the weight of memory, of struggle, of defiance. Every preserved jar, every hard loaf, every bitter broth tells a story not written in textbooks, but passed hand to hand, bite by bite, across generations. And now, as you sit wherever you are, maybe with coffee, tea, a meal beside you, remember that every simple dish has roots tangled deep in forgotten histories like these: war, hunger, survival. They shape not just nations, but kitchens, recipes, and communities. And speaking of community, I want to hear your story. Drop a comment below. Tell me where you're tuning in from, what traditions your family holds on to, what recipes connect you to your roots, especially those passed down with a side of resilience. And hey, if you've enjoyed unraveling this hidden history with me, don't forget to hit that subscribe button. Join this growing community of curious minds, where we bring the overlooked, the untold, and the bizarre corners of history back to life, one story at a time. Your voice matters here. Share your thoughts, your history, and what you've learned from this journey. I'll be reading the comments, so let's keep the conversation alive. Thanks for sticking with me through this wild ride into forgotten kitchens, battlefield meals, and the unbreakable human spirit simmering beneath every spoonful. I'll see you in the next deep dive. Until then, stay curious, stay resilient, and remember, behind every meal there's a story worth telling.